Now let's talk about that other thing. So we did talk about squeezing and pressure a lot. Now let's talk about resistance. So the more pressure you put in on something, the more it's going to increase flow. But the more resistance, that's going to decrease flow. So blood flow is inversely proportional to resistance. So resistance is pretty much a catch-all term. Many things can impede blood flow throughout your body. So resistance is kind of referring to anything that can prevent or slow blood flow in these vessels, or anything that involves the vasculature. So what we have here is that one thing that can affect it is the viscosity. So viscosity in layman's terms is kind of like how thick a fluid is. So like you might have heard like blood is thicker than water. So that means blood is more viscous than water. And it is because it has all the cells, it has all these proteins and solutes. So which would be easier to drink through a straw? This or not being paid advertising here, but which can you drink through a straw easier, water or this really thick shake? Well, here's the thing. If you've ever gone to to Wendy's, do they give you actually a regular straw? Well, if you try to suck this through a straw, it's going to collapse that straw, right? They usually give you that kind of hybrid straw and spoon because it's so thick and viscous that you can't actually put it through a straw. So because this has more viscosity, the more viscous your blood is, the harder it will be to travel through your blood vessels. But again, which is easier to drink through a straw? The stuff that's less viscous, the stuff that's thinner. Now, the thing about this, I just mentioned this more as a FYI because it's really hard to affect the viscosity of your blood to the point that would affect hemodynamics, but just letting you know it is something that contributes to resistance. So another thing that can affect resistance is the overall length of a vessel. Now, don't try this at home, or actually, like, well, you can try the first part at home. So, if you've swam around here in Hawaii or anywhere else, you might have used a snorkel, and it's pretty easy to, not as easy as breathing normally, but most people don't have a problem using a snorkel, right? Now, what happens if you try to breathe through a garden hose? Chances are you might try to breathe at first with the existing air inside the garden hose, but you probably won't last very long. And why is that? Well, interesting thing is that here we have a cross section or a little section of a vessel. The thing is that within the vessel you have surface area, you have all this cells and all this texture, and as things flow through it, it's going to experience friction with that surface area. Now, what if you double the length of, and let's use our equation. So here's our first example. We're setting a base right here. And remember our flow, we're going to approximate it and just say flow equals pressure over resistance. Now, what happens if you double the length? Well, by doubling the length, you have double the surface area that's in contact with whatever's flowing through this vessel. So by doubling the surface area, you actually double the resistance. So twice the length, twice the surface area, twice the friction, twice the resistance. Now, in this second example, since we have twice the resistance, let's do a little algebra and separate this from our pressure and resistance. Hey, let's substitute this into here. So if we look at flow 2 compared to flow 1, the flow through this second vessel is going to have half the rate of flow as the first vessel. So just from the increased surface area, that's going to slow things further along. The more something travels along this length, it's going to slow down this overall flow because you have more surface area contact with the blood. So again, longer something is, the more resistance you have. Okay, so then now is it just about length? What about the cross section? What about the diameter? And which is easier to drink through? If you had a big straw like this, or if you had a single cocktail straw. So then, which is easier to drink through? Well, you're probably able to drink at a faster rate from a big straw than you are with a tiny cocktail straw. And why is that? Well, the thing is that you can get more volume through this bigger straw, right? So the interesting thing is that when you have a narrowing of a vessel by half, that actually increases the resistance by 16. And you might be like, wait, why isn't it increasing the resistance by 2? Well, we have to get to a more complicated equation to explain why that happens. But basically what happens here, the bigger a tube is, the more flow you have through that. Or another extreme example, which is going to have a faster rate of flow, a big river or your drainage gutter. Well, again, the wider it is, the deeper it is, the more diameter you have, more chance for or more flow that can occur through that, versus trying to put that same volume through a very small tube. So this is why diameter is actually a very powerful influence on resistance. And this is where we have to get to this equation, and it's called the PHYL equation. And this is actually applies to many different types of dynamics, and it's actually found has a lot of applications. And this is why if you have half the diameter, it actually has 16 times the resistance. So what happens is that, remember, diameter is just like twice your radius, right? So if you half your radius, what is that going to do to your overall, this overall equation? What's 1/2 to the 4th power? That's 1/16. So this is why you have, like, if you half your radius of a vessel, it actually slows down things by a factor of 16. And what do all these letters in Greek mean? So we did talk about viscosity, we did talk about vessel length, and now the radius. Because of this to the 4th power, that's why just changing it by 2 makes it change by a factor of 16. And this is another equation, so what it's doing is just taking flow right here, and kind of flipping it around. So this is why flow is proportional to pressure over resistance. So this part right here, everything that's not the pressure part, that's the resistance. So this PHYL guy, he's pretty brilliant because this equation has many applications. It's not just talking about hemodynamics and blood flow, but also things like IV drips. If you want to increase the flow through a IV tubing and that line, well, maybe have a wider radius in the tube. Or like pulmonology, if you have an opening or narrowing of your airways, by changing the radius of your airways, it's going to change the flow and resistance through your airways. And even engineering and fluid dynamics and oil rigging, it all involves the movement of something through a tube. And this equation actually handles a lot of that dynamics of something moving through a tube.